coming, for attending this evening. My name is Dennis Doyle. I'm the planning director for Ulster County. Handling the technology for us tonight is Rob Leibowitz, and Rob is a principal planner with the office. I want to thank Barton LaJudas and John Steinmetz and Glenn Gadali from Barton LaJudas for putting on this presentation for us tonight. We've had some discussions about some of the content here. And Barton LaJudas is a local engineering firm. It's a very large firm. It has a local office in Ellenville. And I think they have another office in New Paltz, as I recall. But they're a very large engineering firm and planning firm. They've been around for quite a while. We've done a lot of work with Barton LaJudas on trail work. They're currently working on 2 trails for us. So this is our first work with them tonight with respect to some of the planning work that they do. I want to thank them for doing that. And I'm going to turn it over to John from Barton LaJudas. I'm going to ask everybody to hold their questions till the end of it. And then what we'll do is you can use the chat function or the Q&A function on Zoom if you have any questions. I'll try to moderate, or Rob will try to moderate some of those as time goes on. So we really appreciate your attendance. And John, go ahead, take it away.
Dennis, thank you. I'll do my introductions later. Thank you, Dennis, for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to talk with everyone tonight. As I said, I wished a couple things. I mean, obviously, I wish COVID wasn't a thing, and I wish everyone was, the people who have been impacted by COVID were healthy and with us, but unfortunately, that's not the case. So I'd love to be down there in person. Normally, I would have come down and toured the communities and had Dennis or Rob, kind of show me some of the sites of Ulster County. And I've been there a handful of times, but not recently. So, if you're looking for some local context, just fire some questions at Dennis and myself through the Q&A, because unfortunately I wasn't able to weave in local situations into my presentation like I normally would try to. So I see some of you are getting the hang of the polling. Hopefully this is working well for everyone. So, normally I would do a show of hands to kind of get a read on who's in the audience. So this is not mine, but this is the new version of that these days. So if you're using your phone, you can just kind of, once you hit your dots, you have to scroll down and hit the submit button. So once you make your selection on your phone, just scroll up and hit submit. I'm not using the laptop version, so I don't know where the submit button lives on the laptop, but I see we've got 25 responses, and as you can see, planning board members kind of are winning out the day this evening in terms of attendance. Good to know. This is helpful. And I'm not going to wait for everyone to poll in. It looks like we've got 52 people currently. So for the sake of time, once I get over 25-ish people, I'm just going to move on to the next slide so we can keep things moving along and get through the evening. So good representation tonight from various decision makers around the county. And let's move on to the next polling question. So one of the things we're going to talk about tonight is density. So when you hear the word density, what concerns you the most? What are some of the perceptions of when you hear the word density? Might be negative, might be positive, but what comes up when you hear the word density? What pops in your mind? You can literally just type in, it doesn't have to be 2 words, you can type in 1 or 2 words, and we'll see what people think when they hear the word density. Change, interesting. So the larger ones have been inputted more than once. Bad architecture. Oh, I like this. Lack of context. Clearly, we've got some people with some design sensitivities. That's always good. We appreciate that. Head count. I like density. Loss of habitat. Housing justice. Too close, fear. Conforming, how to apply. Too many bodies, okay. So population, overpopulation, congestion, 3 of the big ones. So we'll talk a little bit about that once we get into the PowerPoint. So with that, I'm going to move on. Now, this is not a survey question, so don't worry about it. First, we want to just kind of introduce the concept of what's going to happen. We're going to show you, I think it's around 20 images. And this is a community preference survey. It's also referred to as a visual preference survey. You may have done this in some of your training. And it's a visual survey intended to identify your attitudes towards different types of development. Given the nature of the discussion this evening and the limits of technology, where we've pared this down, we normally would do a 50 to 60 image survey. Tonight, like I said, it's closer to 20. And you know, we find this invaluable to not only gauge your preferences, but also it has the byproduct of informing the community of various design practices and typologies that they may not be aware of. And our goal as planners, when we're on a consulting assignment, is to ensure that the plan or the code we're working on reflects the residents' and stakeholders' desired community character. So this survey is an invaluable way for us to do our planning and code writing efforts. And no two surveys are ever the same, so they're tailor-made for each project and each place. And it's a pretty simple exercise. If you're here, you've already got the website and the code, and we're gonna ask you to rate what you see. There's buildings, there's landscaping, there's parking, there's signage, everything you see, kind of the entirety of the image. We want you to rate it, scale from 1 to 5. 5 if you really like what you see, 1 if you really don't like what you see. And we're gonna go a little slowly at first, and then we'll speed up as people kind of get the hang of it. So the first set of images are residential images. And so this is a rural farmstead. None of these images are in Ulster County. So if you're trying to figure out where this is not Ulster County. This is actually, I believe, the town of York. So on your phone, if you were driving by this, is this something you'd say, geez, I like the bucolic setting? Or is this something you'd say, no, geez, I don't like farmsteads. I wish it was a Walmart. So if you like this type of imagery in this setting, give it a high score, a 4 or 5. If you don't like what you see, give it a 0 or 2, or a 1 or 2. So just looking at how the polling's going, not completely surprising that there's a lot of 4s and 5s and much fewer 1s and 2s. So clearly this is an appealing image to the people on this training. Moving on to the next image, large lot residential development. Again, feel free to start entering your preference whenever you're ready. Once we get over 20, I'm kind of opposite bar chart formation. So 1s and 2s kind of win the day, and then a little grouping in the middle, and not a lot of loving that image. Okay, and another smaller lot residence. And as you're scoring, I'll keep talking. The time permitting, my colleague Grace is on the call, and she will take these results while I'm doing the training. And then if there's time, we can share with you the actual statistical average, the combined averages for some of these images. So in addition to what you're seeing here, we can actually give you a little bit more feedback on comparisons, time permitting. So all in all, you got 16 on one end, 8 on the low end, and then the 8's kind of, the 3 is kind of indifferent. Okay. Image 4. Okay, pretty solid groupthink there. Okay. Image 5. Okay, it's appealing to a little more than half. Image 6. Zeros. All right, nobody loved it. Okay, not saying I agree or disagree, just commenting. Image 7, this might be the final residential image. Can't remember. Okay. So 19, 20 of you find it pretty favorable, whereas only 4 of you find it unfavorable, and then kind of the 7 of you are kind of in the middle. All right. So now we're going to move on to multifamily. Same exercise, same scoring. This is townhomes. Pretty split across the board. Okay. Interesting. Image 2 for multifamily. Negatory Rampart. Okay, nobody really cared for that. Just a handful of you. Image 3, ignore the snow. I know, you know, it's on its way, but don't let the snow influence your score on this one. Again, pretty negative perceptions of that one. Similar to the previous image. Moving on to image 4. Okay. You know, so more than a third of you liked what you see, but not a lot of haters on that one. Okay, good to know. Image 5 for multi-family questions. Nobody loved it. A lot of people hated it. Okay. This is also multifamily. A lot of people like that one. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about a lot of these throughout the presentation, but we'll talk about that one for a minute too. These are all multifamily buildings. Yeah, somebody commented, these don't show enough context in the frames. We understand and appreciate that. It's a limitation to the survey. And given this, I'll tell you at the end how we would normally put more of this in context, but given the nature of this training, it's a little, you guys are flying a little more blind than a typical exercise that we would use this on. But this is helpful. So this one was pretty well liked. So now we're moving on to commercial and mixed use environments and landscapes. So this is a mixed use building. retail first floor and residential and office upper. Okay. Another mixed use building. No office in this one, just retail and residential. Four and five is combined win, but a large contingent, about a third of you are indifferent, which that's okay. Nothing wrong with being indifferent. Image 3 for multifamily and mixed use, or excuse me, mixed use and commercial. Sorry, this is retail below and then residential and commercial above. A lot of people like that one. Catherine, I see you raised your hand. We're almost done. We've got just a few images left, and then Rob, if you want to take Catherine's question, I'll defer to you and Dennis. So image 4 for commercial and mixed use. Okay, pretty similar groupthink there. Message received. Okay. Negative. Got it. Image 6. This is a first floor bank, second floor office. "23 of you, 2/3 of you liked it. Only a couple of you didn't like what you saw." Okay. Commercial streetscape. All right, and now this is the same streetscape with a lot of different improvements to it, which we'll talk more about in the presentation. Opposite. So the before image of the streetscape, I don't think there was anyone who gave it a 5. The after image, nobody gave it a 1. No one gave it as 2. So 4s and 5s were clearly the higher scoring images, the most common scores, I should say, for this image. So pretty dramatic as a planner, pretty dramatic difference. And one of the things that the two images, let me see if I can go back for a second, which I know I can. So you've got your before image, 5-story roadway, 1-story commercial development, power lines. You've got your after image, street reconstruction project with some medionettes. Street trees obviously have been simulated to show trees at full height, so much fuller tree canopy. And then the private side, these 3-story mixed-use buildings along the background. So I want you to keep this in mind. There's no wrong answers to these surveys. I mean, our job as planning consultants is to distill your local vision and your local values. But it's just helpful to us to understand where the sensitivities are to things you may or may not like. So what's intriguing off of these two images and some of the other ones we saw is that a lot of the images that scored very highly had a fair amount of density in them. Now, some of them had low density residential development and some had farmland, and that scored very high as well. But what I saw in the word cloud was a lot of people had concerns about density. When we asked you to rate some images that had density in it, the response was generally favorable. So let's pick up on that, and let's try to talk a little bit about density and good community design. So I am going to X out of that so Grace can reduce the data, hopefully. And if it doesn't work out, that's okay. So let's get started. This is not Ulster County. I just think when a lot of people hear the word density, they think of skyscrapers. They think of incredibly dense developments. And I often think of traffic, which we heard and saw in the word cloud, heard, air quotes, heard it through the computer, increased traffic. There's concerns about loss of farmland and loss of open space. There's concern about new neighbors. But I also would put forth that denser sometimes mixed use projects, sometimes not mixed use projects, but a dense development pattern can produce some of the best examples of good architecture, more inspiring, larger scale, more grand architectural accomplishments along our streets. So I think that's important. Important byproduct of density is significant architecture, which then contributes to the sense of place for the places we care about in our downtowns, our hamlets, and our walkable neighborhoods. So I think density can be a positive contribution to all of the things we like about our community, but by the same token, it can be detrimental to the characteristics of our community if not done properly. Also I forgot about this one, also density allows people to age in place, which is becoming more and more critical as our population ages. So I never did introduce myself. I figured I would do this now. As Dennis said, I'm a certified planner with Barton & LaJudas. I've got 25 plus years experience doing various town, village, and city consulting assignments. Most of my professional career has been in consulting, about 20 years of it. I did a little over 5 years as a employee for the city of Rochester in its planning and zoning departments. I've also volunteered on my town conservation board. I'm a former planning board chair, which means my time spent in the city of Rochester code office and planning office as a conservation board member and a village planning board chair means I've been faced with a lot of the decisions that you are faced with on a monthly basis, whether you meet once a month or twice a month in your various boards. I've had those discussions with applicants and developers and property owners very similar to what you have had. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say I'm also a planning and zoning geek. I'm one of those people that are fortunate enough to really like what they do. So if you've got questions related to the topic tonight, great. If you want to go off on a different tangent, take my phone number down at the end, take my email address, and I'd be happy to talk planning and community development with you at length. As Dennis said, I work with Barton & LaJudas, B&L. We answer to either. I think many of you may be familiar with us more for our infrastructure work, water, sewer, transportation, and the like. But we do a lot more than that. You may be familiar with some of our funding applications. We're very adept at getting funding. You know, we've gotten almost $35 million over the last 4 rounds of CFA for our clients. But tonight, the more relevant piece of our service portfolio is the community planning piece. Myself and my staff spend most of our days working on planning efforts such as comprehensive plans, waterfront envisioning efforts, transportation and corridor studies, rural planning efforts, whether it's farmland preservation, right to farm laws, things of that nature. We do review board assistance and regulatory updates, and those updates take the form of either an assessment, a partial downtown district, for example, a partial amendment, or a comprehensive zoning law review or revision, whatever the case may be. It's all a little different. Town and village law, it could be a code, could be an ordinance, but we do a lot of that throughout the state. So we'll touch on COVID a little bit, but because you have to, how can we not, and the impact that it will have, but we don't know the extent that COVID will have. So I do think it's important to look back to COVID really took hold in March. So I want to talk a little bit about what were we thinking about as planners and community members leading up to last March, and which one of these trends are still relevant, which ones have been exacerbated, and what does it mean in terms of density design and community development. So let's start with the aging of our population. We're still continuing to become an older population. People over the age of 55 and 65 are continuing to grow in terms of number. And, for decades, if any of you are in that age group, for decades, you were the most coveted age group. Everyone wanted your money. Everyone was catering to you. You had the ultimate buying power of any cohort in our country, but that's not the case any longer. You've been usurped by millennials. In 2017, millennials now have more spending power than any other age group. And millennials, in case you're wondering, are the youngsters born between 82 and 2004. A lot of our staff is millennials, and I love them. I know they get a lot of sarcastic, bad press and things of that nature, and some sarcastic jabs here and there. And we always joke around about, I'm the old guy in the office. They're young, but I think they're a great group of people to work with. And by 2030, they're going to outnumber boomers by 22 million people. Why do I focus on the boomers and the millennials? Because right before COVID hit, those two age groups were very interested in the same type of housing, which is smaller housing in more walkable areas. So let's talk about our housing trends over the last 20 years and looking ahead. So these two pie charts, the pie chart on the left, start with that one, represent two 20-year periods. The one on the left represents the home purchases between 1990 and 2010. So during that period, 77%, 3/4 of home buyers were looking for, at one point in that 20-year period, were looking for their peak house. It'll be their largest house to raise a family in, whatever the case may be. So that largest house purchase was 3/4 of the home buyers were doing that in that 20-year period. Fast forward to the next 20 years, 2010 to 2030, which we're smack dab in the middle of that period. During the 2 decades we're currently in, 74% of home buyers will be looking at some point to downsize. So peak housing from 1990 to 2010, downsizing of homes from 2010 to 2030. Now, will COVID impact this? Yes. How much, we're not sure, and I'll talk about that in a second. So if everyone's looking to downsize, not everyone, what if 3/4 of the people will be looking to downsize over the 20-year period, how does our housing stock line up with what's available? The short answer is it doesn't. So you've got, owner preference for small lot and attached housing being very high, 75%. Again, in that 75% range, our supply is only 48%. So that's why you're seeing, up until COVID, you were seeing fewer single family large lot residential subdivisions. I'm not saying you weren't seeing any, but you were seeing fewer of them and more multifamily, patio home, mixed use type projects, because that's what the millennials and the boomers were looking for. Less house, less property to maintain. Now, I think COVID has tweaked that a little. I don't know how long that COVID impact will last, and I'm not going to try to hypothesize. I think that'll be something we all kind of take note of. But I do think the millennials, at least in this few months since COVID has hit, the millennials are undaunted. They're still buying smaller starter homes in mass. There's bidding wars across the state for property for these small walkable neighborhoods. So the demand is still there despite COVID. Other trends that we were seeing pre-COVID, the decline in bricks and mortar retail. Only one new mall has opened in our country since 2007. The retail experience, the ones that have been successful are focusing more on the experiential nature of retail, lifestyle centers, things of that nature. And, you can look at some of the statistics on this infographic. Retail sales in bookstores were down by 46%, home furnishing 28%, and so on and so forth. So bricks and mortar retail was struggling pre-COVID, and then COVID hit and really blasted it out of the water. Online retail sales were growing about 1% a year over the last decade. Since COVID, in the last 6 months, it's jumped from 10% of retail sales to 25%. So now online retail is 25% of all retail sales. And will that go back after COVID? Probably it'll tick down a little, but it won't go back to 10%. I think the behavioral change has started due to COVID. So I think online sales will continue to erode at bricks and mortar retail. Other trends we're seeing, obesity. 6 out of every 10 adults in New York State is considered obese. So that's something you want to keep in mind. I got to move our faces here so I can read some of these slides. Social isolation is an issue. People who are lonely or social isolated have a 29% higher risk of disease, a study found. But there is a silver lining. People who live in neighborhoods with sidewalks were 47% more likely to be active. And again, this is pre-COVID, this is from a couple years ago. Urban Land Institute said, in contrast to the past, a time when home buyers wanted their own space, future buyers will want everything closer. People want density. They don't mind living in a certain place as long as they have access to walkability, amenities, and leisure around them. And I still think that holds true. I think the amenities, leisure, and the proximity will change because of COVID, but I do still think that people are going to want these vibrant places. They're just going to need, the streetscapes are going to continue to change because of COVID. How restaurants deal with COVID, outdoor activities are going to change because of COVID. But I do think activity is going to be an attraction to people. So what are some of the benefits of density? There used to be a thought process of, well, if I'm a single family homeowner, which I am, and there's a multifamily complex near my house, it's going to hurt my property values. Studies say that's actually not the case. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but it was a national study done. I think I should have wrote it down. I think this is a National Association of Home Builders. If you've got a standalone single family home, your value accrued by about 2.5%, just over 2.5%. Whereas if you were near a multifamily project, your value accrued at just under 3%. And then they broke it down by low-rise multifamily versus high-rise multifamily. So single-family homes near multifamily projects actually accrued in value at a higher rate than single-family homes that were farther away or nowhere near a multifamily project. Benefits, or the other benefits include reducing our reliance on the automobile. Single-family detached homes produce about 10 vehicle trips a day, whereas apartment dwellers, about 6. The other 4 are usually accomplished by walking or multi-chaining trips together. And that doesn't seem like much if you're just talking about one home, but if you extrapolate that out to 10 single family homes, that's 100 trips versus 10 apartments, that's 60. So that's a difference of 40 trips a day. So the reduction of vehicle trips, greenhouse gas emissions, et cetera, it's a tangible proven benefit to denser living. In terms of economic value of density, I'm not going to focus so much on the residential on the blue lines here at the bottom, but this chart focuses on property taxes per acre by use and essentially by density. So if you look at Walmart, for example, this data set is 21 different cities. Looked at 21 different cities had one or more Walmarts in them or adjacent to them. Walmart's contributed about $7.20 per acre in taxes. You look at a mall or strip development, they did about double what Walmart did. But when you look at more of the downtown, more of the multi-story projects, it dwarfs the contributions to the tax base that malls or Walmarts contribute. A 2-story mixed building contributes about $76 of tax dollars per acre. That's over 10 times what a Walmart would contribute. A 3-story mixed-use building comes up to about 120 an acre, and then a larger 5 to 7-story building contributes approximately $402 in taxes per acre. As you can see, it dwarfs suburban strip and commercial development, and then Walmart. So density is good for the economic bottom line of a community and its tax structure. So let's talk about what density looks like, what it feels like. One thing I think it's good to say here is that I'm not going into a detailed design presentation as part of this. We do a lot of design training, kind of a design 101. I'm kind of skipping over that because when Dennis challenged me and said, let's talk a little bit more about density and design, I had to cull down the good presentation part of the good design part of the presentation. But I think you'll pick up on it as we go. So let's start with single family homes and density. A lot of people don't necessarily think of single family homes as being a part of the density discussion, but it is and it should be. Obviously, this is one of the images that you scored earlier and it ranked very highly. People love rural America, and I think density is one way to actually preserve rural America. And so let's start by getting our single family residential districts fixed and in better shape when it comes to density. This is an example of 5 acre lots. You guys scored this image, and I recall it's not scoring very well. So this was deemed as not desirable by many of you, and yet that was deemed as very desirable by many of you. So I give you credit because I think you picked up on the difference, and not everyone does, between rural character and low density residential. I think they're two different things, and I think they often get talked about interchangeably. So I give those of you who took the survey credit. So that was not a very high scoring image. You did not score this one, but this is a 3 acre lot. These are 1 acre lots. And then ultimately you did score this one. And these are 1/4 acre. And actually I think these are smaller than 1/4 acre lots. This one scored very highly. So the two highest scoring images of this set, you didn't score all of these, but rural America scored very high and this one scored very high. So I think the concept of single family homes that are very dense, walkable neighborhoods in close proximity to rural America can work if done properly through good development practices and good review practices by people like yourself. I didn't create this graphic. I've always thought it was kind of cool when you think about you know, the scale of rural development and low density residential. You know, so this graphic shows 25 acre lots versus 21 1/4 acre lots up here in the upper right hand corner. You just get an idea and the order of magnitude of how much 5 acres can consume and how big it is compared to 1 1/4 acre lots. The other thing that strikes me about this image is that clearly farming in this area is gone. 5 acre lots do not a farm make. So when it comes to single family density, what should we be thinking about? A few things. Reduce the dimensions. Start by reducing your minimum lot sizes. Start by reducing lot widths and front setbacks, and we'll talk more about that in a second. Some codes have minimum house sizes. You don't see them everywhere, but they're more common than you might think. You could consider eliminating those. And then these are more rare, but some communities do institute residential design standards or guidelines. We usually see them in more urban environments like cities and entering suburbs, but that is something that you could also entertain. But you know, considering reducing your size requirements and house size requirements is a good starting point for allowing some more density to come in at the single family level. For instance, a lot of the communities we do planning and zoning as have streets like this. This is an upstate New York village. This happens to be Avon. We did their comprehensive plan in 2017. And one of the things that they boasted about was their walkable village streets, and they love their traditional character. And we hear that a lot. We hear that in, you know, upstate, in villages across upstate and even in downstate. You know, we love our walkable streets, the architecture, the trees, the tree lawns, the traditional character. And I grew up in a village, I live in a village, so I would concur with all of that opinion and sentiment. What's unfortunate is, and I'll show you other examples in a minute, most communities don't allow that type of development anymore. So this is the village of Avon, and all those blue parcels are all residential parcels that don't meet their minimum lot width. They require, currently their code requires a 100-foot minimum lot width. Well, all those homes I just showed you, which are right here, none of those conform. So some of the most walkable streets in Avon are no longer allowed by code. So number one, if they burn down, they couldn't be rebuilt without a variance, which is just stupid. And then two, if you like this kind of development pattern, why aren't you allowing it to continue further out? The 100-foot lot width creates essentially a more suburban development pattern by code. So if you like this, zone for it. If you don't like this, don't zone for it. I'm not saying this is the only way people should zone their property or their community, but if this appeals to you, if this level of density appeals to you to create neighborhoods, zone appropriately. If not, you may get something like this. So we scored this, and this didn't score very high. So a lot of modern codes are essentially requiring you build this and saying, no, you can't build this. And I'm not saying this should be built everywhere, but I think the discussion needs to occur at the local level, is saying, look, if a developer came in and wanted to do something like this and really build a neighborhood, but our code says he has to build housing or she has to build housing, maybe we need to look at our code and maybe we can do better. Just so we don't pick on Avon, because I really do like Avon quite a bit. They're nice folks. We see this around the state. You've got 50% of lots in the Village of Ballston Spa do not conform. Again, they've got a residential lot width in these older traditional developed areas. 67% of the Village of Corinth are non-conforming, 75% in South Glen Falls. And the winner is the city of Geneva. 76% of their traditional, most walkable village neighborhoods do not conform to their code. All those communities, and if there's an attorney on the call, I apologize, but I always make fun of attorneys because generally speaking, most codes, especially older codes from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, were written by attorneys who didn't understand character and didn't get the dimensions right. So when you go in and you look at your code, look at your front yards that you like, you can physically measure, especially with Google Earth or Google Maps, how far are the homes set back? How wide are the lots of the areas you really like? And if you like it and you are thinking more development may come to your community, why not try to replicate that at the single family level? Moving up the density spectrum to 2-family homes. I didn't tell you during the survey just because I didn't think it was relevant, but this is actually a built as 2-family home. So you have, if you can envision the line right down the middle, the front door, a little off to the right, that's unit 1. And then down the sidewalk to the left and that little picket fence, right there, you turn a hard left or hard right, and that's the door to unit 2. To the left of this property is a single family home. To the right of the property is a 4-unit row house. So you've got a single family home that's designed to look like and feel like a 2-family home. Very traditional architecture. Another 2-family home example, built in probably sometime in the 80s, a little more suburban in character, garage on both ends. But this whole neighborhood, most of, I won't say all, but most of this neighborhood is 2-family homes. And you can see the idea was to have them read as much as possible as a single family home in terms of character. These kind of look a little bit like McMansions, and I would say they could fall in that category, but these are also 2-family homes, built as 2-family homes. So when you're talking about density, I would say consider this. I'm not saying this should be everywhere, but there's a lot of different models out there for 2-family homes and multifamily homes, which we'll talk about in a minute, that are a little different, and I would dare say help with community character and help preserve some of the things that we care about in our rural and urban places. So when you're talking about 2-family homes, give it some thought. Everyone kind of skips over. I find their 2-family homes are kind of an afterthought. So, when you're talking about low density residential districts, low density almost always means single family, but it doesn't have to. You can see this is definitely low density residential, but 2-family homes. So that's another way to kind of inject some density into your community and, take, in theory, even though I think these are land consumptive sites, the fact that the 2-family homes, you've got 6 families on the screen. It takes up less land than if these were all single family homes, you'd have 3 more houses. So it does preserve land in the long run.
John?
Yes, go ahead.
It's Dennis. Just a quick one. I know you're talking about density and zoning, but it also helps meet the market in this instance as well. One of the things that you brought up in your introduction was the fact that we really have a market disconnect between the types of homes we have and the types of homes that people want. And the idea of looking at downsizing and moving from a single family to a 2-family from a market perspective would also be helpful as well. And it makes the existing land and the existing housing stock work harder than it currently does.
Absolutely. No, thank you, Dennis. I'm glad you chimed in with that. And to that end, accessory dwelling units are another way to do that. We're getting a lot of questions about accessory dwelling units right now. And if you're not familiar with the term, that's okay. I'm going to also refer to them as ADUs. These are granny flats or in-law apartments, as they're traditionally called. And for those of you who are, you know, I was a child of the 70s. If you were a child of the 70s, you might remember Happy Days. And the most famous accessory dwelling unit resident of all time was, in my opinion, is Arthur Fonzarelli. Fonzie lived in an accessory dwelling unit. He lived above their garage. So that is a perfect example of an accessory dwelling unit. Now, when you talk about accessory dwelling units, you do want to give some thought to, do you want to allow them everywhere? I'm not saying there's a right or wrong answer to these concerns or issues. You just need to think about them. Sometimes communities say, you know what, I like the idea, but I want it to be owner occupied. Some communities say you can only have one in the main structure. So Fonzie could live in the house, but he can't live over the garage. Some communities say then if they're going to do that, they need to be able to accommodate an additional off-street parking space. So, you know, when you consider permitting two-family houses by right or special permit or accessory dwelling units, there are some other considerations that you want to do through your zoning code and through the zoning tools that are available to you. I saw a flash. Did we have a question or? Okay, I'll just keep going. Multifamily options. Let's move up the density scale a little more. You guys scored this image. I don't remember how this one scored, so we'll have to see at the end if there's time. I don't recall this one, but this is, these are all multifamily properties. Some are double, some are triple, some are quads. And the developer who did this project actually had their designer, one of the best design firms in the country, came out and surveyed all the local farmsteads, homes, turn of the century, 150-year architecture to find out what the local vernacular is and was of the day, and then mimicked multifamily project around those typologies. So the developer took great care in trying to come up with homes and buildings that looked like they fit in this rural setting. And I think, all in all, I think it's a great project. I think some of the apartment barn-like structures, which I'm not showing you today, but I'd be happy to send you a picture or two. I think they're a little too massive, but I think this type of typology can work in kind of a hamlet setting. Another rural typology, much different in scale. This is actually an affordable housing project in the Finger Lakes that an architect friend of mine's firm did. Excuse me, and he did the same thing. He looked around at, if we're building one of the bigger structures around, we need to have other local typologies to draw from, and the biggest structures in rural America generally tend to be barns. So he actually did a design study of local barns across 3 different townships, and several of them had the peak structure like this, several of them had the cupolas. So that's the design cues that they took to make this affordable housing project happen. You guys scored this one, and I think it scored okay. I don't think this was like off the charts popular, but I think it scored okay. So you're moving up the density scale in terms of multifamily. These town homes were built in the probably late 80s, mid 90s, something like that. Very traditional in character. These are a little more urban. You did not score this, but again, more townhomes here, single family home down in the background of this photo. And then to the left of the photo, you can't see it, that would be the commercial district. So provides a very natural transition from an urban setting to single family neighborhoods in this particular case.
John, before you go on, if you could go back to that.
Sure.
Could you just talk a little bit about the attention to detail here in terms of the cornices, the setback in the windows, the brickwork, the change of materials that make this project work?
Yes, I will. I will. So that'll save me time later. I've got a slide on that, but let's talk about it here because it's as good as any place to talk about it. So Dennis is right. The detail matters. I don't have the crappy image, but you guys scored it very poorly. When if you recall, there was those townhouses that were all yellow siding. They all looked the same. There was no relief. So let me move my faces here. And so in this, everything in this image works. You've got the proximity to the sidewalk. Now, could the setback be a little more, and then they could put trees in front of the building? Sure, that would be okay too. But the proximity to the sidewalk works. It frames the street. You've got the materials are top notch. You've got real brick. You've got, I'm assuming this is hardy plank or maybe real wood siding, most likely hardy plank or cement siding if you don't know the brand name. And what they've done, so instead of just a flat facade structure, Each of these have one, they've got these little bump outs like to the left here, and then you've got these bay windows. And then even between each unit, each of the units are set back in plane. So you go from brick, then the second one in with the green trim is set back even further. The first one, which is middle, the first one with clapboard siding is in the middle. That is now ahead of the other building. So you have a visual relief as you're going down the project, and it's not just a flat, sterile facade, which is critical. And it creates shadowing and other kinds of effects of the houses. You have entranceways, which help to make openings kind of push into the building, which makes the facades look more permeable and more approachable. And then you get the tiny detail work of the trim. As Dennis said, you've got beautiful cornice work. You've got trim work on all these outcroppings and bay windows. Now, if I were an architectural preservationist architect, which I'm not, the only critique I could say on this is some of these windows probably have fake panes, but that's getting to the level of detail of good design. You know, whether it's a divided light or a genuine divided light or a simulated divided light. But other than that, the building scale, the finish, and the attention to detail is exceptional in this row of buildings. And I apologize, I don't have the crappy version up here because it'd be a really fun before and after comparison. And the same goes for this project. Same idea, quality materials, real brick, hardy board or clapboard siding, shutters, dormers, etc. So the design features of this project are very similar in terms of intent as the design features in this project, but they're executed very differently. How's that, Dennis?
That's great, thank you.
And then you can, jumping ahead, I'll just finish on my thought. You can codify all that, and we'll talk about that. So this is another project I like. It was built from scratch. So this is a newly constructed project. It's not a retrofit, and it's a multifamily apartment building. So it's designed to look like a mansion. I don't know how many units are in it, but the density works out to be about 23 units an acre. I don't think there's 23 units in this, but that gives you an idea how dense it is. So there's more and more examples of this mansion typology to essentially hide apartment buildings that you're seeing around the country. I wouldn't call it commonplace, but it's not uncommon anymore. So when someone's proposing a multifamily project, these are some different envelopes that they can have. You can have a mansion, you can have row houses, etc. Or you can have more of this traditional apartment building. This is not a row house. There's no walk-up separate entrances. This is a true apartment building in every sense of the word. They're not trying to hide it like a mansion. They're saying we're a large building and we're going to be unapologetic for it. It's a grand statement of architecture, whether you love the architecture or not. I'd love to talk about that with you over a beer sometime, but it still does a lot of things right. It's parking's in the back. You've got relief, you've got brick and quality materials. The brick sections are protruded out. The clapboard sections are recessed back. You have architectural detailing with arched windows on the bottom, arched window on the top, peaked roof down here to the left. So there's a lot of different things happening visually in this building that make for a really nice building. Plus the fact that it's up to the street. If you took the same building and put it behind a half acre of parking, it wouldn't have nearly the impact to the street. Kind of the most dense project that I'm showing today, Easton Commons. So again, very grand, very unapologetic, mixed rate development. You have some people in this project are paying $800 a month. Some people are paying $4,000 a month. And you can see it's unapologetically grand in terms of its scale. Not saying it's for everybody, but I think it can work. So we covered a lot of these already, thanks to Dennis's question, but the building and site design standards with multifamily are as or more important than even some commercial standards, depending on who you ask. So no front yard parking is key. Potentially limiting the number of units per building. So even these really nice design buildings, if they're too long and too monolithic, it can be a problem. So breaking up larger sections of building to say, look, you can have no more than 8 or 12 units in a building before you have to create a new building, and maybe a right angle or setback or something like that. We've talked about breaks in the facade. We've talked about architectural detailing. We've talked about being close to the street in urban settings. We have not talked a lot about rural landscape, and we talked a little bit about the barn examples and things like that. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of great examples of rural apartment buildings because they're hard to see. The good rural apartment buildings are tucked back behind a hillside or down along a nest of trees. So this can be done in the rural setting. It just takes it takes great care in the siting of the building.
John, just a quick,
Yeah.
just a quick. It's not only in terms of breaking up the length of buildings, but also breaking up the repetition of buildings. If you have 10 buildings on an apartment site and all 10 buildings are exactly the same, you really haven't accomplished a design objective associated with trying to make the project interesting and trying to make sure that you're finding a design vernacular. If essentially you can't tell which building you're in until you actually walk in the door.
Yeah, and Dennis, I wholeheartedly agree with you. There is another school of thought, and this is why I didn't go to architecture school. There's another school of thought that like an architect friend of mine says, you know, if you look at Santorini, Greece, with all the white buildings and all the blue houses, or Prague, Czechoslovakia, a lot of those places have built form that all look the same. You know, they didn't try to artificially, Santorini, Greece, with all the white buildings and the blue roofs, they didn't try to force a different style or force a different color. So monotony in those places work, according to my architecture friend, and he's right. You know, those are some of the most beautiful places in the world. So he always cautions of, if you had a 10 building development, to use your example, if all 10 is different, his opinion, if he was on the call, he would say that would be forced, and it would be, he said that would look fake to him. I don't necessarily agree, but I just want to throw that out there as a non-design professional. So I think I side with you, Dennis. I think you've got to be real careful of repetition and monotony when you do these multifamily projects.
And I have a tendency, I hear what your friend is coming from. My sense would be is you don't necessarily have to change the form of the building, but if every building has 12 apartment units or 15, you can at least change the size of the building.
Well, yeah, and you could change entrances, you know.
Entrances, size, how they're placed on the lot, the adjacencies, et cetera, so that there are ways that you can do this that essentially the buildings are recognizable in terms of their design aesthetic, but essentially they're not monotonous on the site itself.
And I would go one step further. I would also say, if you're in the world we just entered in hypothetically, is the arrangement of the buildings and the public spaces become critical. Because if it's 10 buildings and they're all surrounded by parking, I don't know if the changing of the door shape is going to be that meaningful. But if you've got 10 buildings and you can start to maybe put them around a square, and that square has some public space in the middle, and you frame that square, now the 10 buildings start to have a function in terms of their placement, rather than just trying to stick them in the middle of parking lots. So it's, yeah, that's a really good question and observation, Dennis. So we're moving on to mixed use and commercial. Again, for the point of time, I didn't put a lot of ugly ones in here. This is just more trying to be positive for a change. There's really, in my opinion, I don't think there's really any such thing as low density mixed use. So I think they kind of start at medium density. I guess low density mixed use would be horizontal mixed use. But so when you go, as soon as you go vertical, I think you're in the realm of medium. So in my opinion, this would be a medium density typology. You've got a grocery store on the first floor, and I'm not sure what's on the second one here. I think it's apartments, or excuse me, office. I think it's office space. So 2-story building that's actually slightly shorter than some of the residential, this not residential in use, but residential in character structures next to it. So not dwarfing the nearby residential structures to the back and the former residential structures to the right. Going up the scale to medium-ish, 3-story structure, similar to the row houses we talked about before, but it's mixed use. So you have a commercial first floor and then upper floor retail, or upper floor office, or residential. But just like the row houses that Dennis picked up on, 6 slides ago, the attention to detail in this row is exquisite. The brickwork, the trim work, the cornices, everything about these buildings are standing seam metal roofs, exceptionally well done, which goes back to my comment from the beginning about retail, the reason why some of these have been so successful pre-COVID is that it offers that experience that a mall can't. So you can window shop and walk around with your family rather than parking in a sea of asphalt and walking in. Not judging either way, but this is what the world talks about when retailers are saying, you know, it needs to be experiential rather than just a mall these days. You guys scored this building as well. This is an infill building, so you've got the original buildings, two-story buildings to the right and to the left. And then obviously this is a much larger infill building. So feel free to have your own thoughts on this, but I was at the city when this building went through, and the developer who did this building is one of the best developers I've ever worked with. Kind man, very concerned about community character and new urbanism, but also a businessman. He said, John, I can't go. They wanted it shorter. The community wanted it shorter. The neighborhood wanted it shorter. He said, John, I just can't make the numbers work. And he actually showed us his books. He said, here, he goes, you know, I'm trying to make, I can't remember what the percentage is. He said, if I lose the first floor, I lose the project. He goes, I just can't do it. He said, I would have to start to cheapen the materials. I would have to start making a building out of vinyl. And he goes, I don't want to do it. He goes, I don't want my name on a building that's got vinyl siding and no architectural detailing. So you've got to keep that in mind. I mean, I do think density is an opportunity to get some high quality urban and rural projects, but you've got to have a little give and take to say, you know, if you're asking for higher quality detailing, architectural treatments, they cost money. So the developer's got to be able to make that back in density. So just keep that in mind. I'm going to move through these. We talked about these. I like this building. It's very large. It's one of the larger buildings. We like this image because I think it's a well done building, but it's big. My experience is most villages say, nope, too big. Small cities say, okay, we're okay with that. So we use this image in our surveys as a way to gauge sensitivity to scale. You know, some communities say too big, too much, but still a decent building. Some communities say, bring it on, we'd love to have that. So zoning tools when it comes to mixed use projects. One of the ones we try to do with our code updates to the extent possible, and sometimes communities are more receptive than others, is to reward good projects. So what we mean by that is establish your design language and some of the things that Dennis and I have been talking about. Establish where you want the building and some of the design features and architectural elements, and be very clear on what you want. And if a project comes forward and proposes to meet your code and your design language, give it an expedited review. This project was a $10 million project, 2 stories of commercial on the first 2 floors, condominiums on the upper floors, very high-end housing. This project was approved in 35 days, and it would have been less, but with seeker and county referral, that ended up being about the 30 days. So this is a $10 million project, multi-story, in a complicated site that got approval in 35 days. Why did it get approved in 35 days? Because if you were to, the code was set up to say, you know, if you don't meet these things, then you need site plan review. If you don't meet these things, then you need additional review. If you meet all these things, then you don't need site plan review. If you meet all these things, you get essentially an expedited review. So the site plan review triggers for the city of Rochester are set up to reward good projects and not penalize them through an unnecessary review. And in order to accomplish that, your codes needs to really be design centric. You need graphics, you need drawings, you need clear measurements. You know, you really got to give designers a lot of information in terms of setbacks and where you want things and why you want them, so they can design the best project. Now, having said that, when I worked for the city of Rochester, you know, their code at the time was pretty progressive and pretty strong. Did we still get really bad development proposals? Of course we did. You know, of course we got suburban developers wanting to build commercial plazas in city neighborhoods that the code said you can't do that anymore. And I just took this picture. My daughter lives in Buffalo, so I was up visiting her. I'm like, oh, I got to get this picture for my presentation for Ulster County. So this is a great example of new code, old code. Old code under the 7-Eleven. I got nothing against 7-Eleven. It's more of how it looks. So you can see the old code said you can be set back, you can have parking in front. We really don't care about the building appearance that much. Give us some token landscaping here to screen the parking lot and we're happy. New code says, one, you can go denser and taller, and please do. but also you've got first floor commercial, you've got upper floor residential, and you've got a real street contribution here. And you look at one of the things we're going to talk about is base, here I'll jump onto it, base, midsection, and crown. You can get into design details. I wouldn't recommend it, but some communities say we want to be all neo-colonial or federalist or Greek revival. So you can advocate for an architectural style. I don't think that's the right way to go, but in certain real historic places it makes sense. But for most communities, 95% of communities that are interested in design language or design requirements, I think you can be simpler. For example, good design usually entails having a base, midsection, and crown to a building. So what does that mean? In this upper example, and you guys rated this bank pretty highly, the base is the first floor. So you have this continual base that's visually separate from the midsection by the belt line. And then as you go to the top, you have this cornice, not the strongest cornice I've ever seen. We saw some prettier ones earlier, but you've got this cornice at the top. So this building has a base, a midsection, and a crown. Let me go back a slide. You can do that on a one-story building as well as a multi-story building, but if you start to look for base, midsections, and crowns, you see them or you don't see them everywhere. So 7-Eleven, they threw this stone water table in for a base. This I would say is a midsection, but there's no crown on the building. This multifamily building, the first floor retail is the base. The next two floors are the midsection, and the crown is this undulating roofline and these awnings. So the awnings and this undulating roofline create the crown effect. We usually, I didn't show you today, but we usually like to use these two images as a pair in our surveys, because most of the surveys we do, even though they're all different images, the common themes are two-story buildings generally score higher than one-story buildings, and buildings that don't have a sea of asphalt out in front of them score higher than buildings with parking in front. So two-story, no parking tends to be the magic formula, or 3 stories or 4 stories. Multi-story with no parking, visible. Obviously, you need parking to make the building successful. So, but these two buildings we love because the lower building never scores very high, but the upper building always scores very high. And the conversations we like to have around it is what Dennis picked up on earlier, is the detailing, or in this case, the lack thereof. So the lower building here, it's 2 stories with no large parking areas, but it still scores a very low score. And I would argue it's because of the architectural detailing. It's the skin. There's not the right amount of transparency along the streetscape. There's not enough detailing. There's no base, there's no midsection, there's no crown. So it doesn't do much right when it comes to what we as pedestrians and Americans think of as traditional Main Street design. And I think that's important when you're starting to codify design, is to get the fundamentals right, get the base, midsection, and crown right, make sure your front door is facing the public sidewalk and facing the street, make sure you have transparency, very high levels of transparency on the first floor. We'll actually go in and measure local transparency requirements. We'll actually measure local storefronts to find out historically what communities have done in that town, village, or city for transparency, and we try to use those as a starting point for our transparency requirements. Upper transparency requirements are usually much lower. We already talked about breaks in facade and changes in materials, and we've already talked about architectural detailing, but they're all very important to not just multifamily projects, but also to mixed-use projects. Other tools and tips in terms of zoning and development review. I want to give Randall Aaron full credit on this. The guy really was ahead of his time. Some of the images I'm going to show you are from this resource. I would highly recommend, if you're a town board member or anyone in a rural community, this is something you should try to track down. I think the old version's out of print, but I think he's got a newer version out now. It really is a great way to visualize how rural density and development can occur. So let's talk about clustering. New York State does allow clustering, and I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with the concept of clustering, but very briefly, it's a technique that can be used to preserve open space, steep slopes, water bodies, farmland, sometimes historic sites, sometimes unique natural formations like a gorge or a knoll or something like that. And the concept is, instead of taking and consuming all the land, and like in the upper left here, with single family homes. So in this particular example, there's 60 total lots, and the site engineer says, oh, 60 homes, each owner is gonna own the entire parcel. So all the land is chopped up and put into these larger 1.5 to 2 acre lots. Clustering says you can still do the same amount of lots, do them on smaller land areas, thereby preserving some of the remaining real estate for parkland, ball field, and in this case around the pond, there was also a steep slope. So instead of mowing the steep slope with grass, this is now a forever wild or something like that. So the idea of clustering can be extremely beneficial, especially in rural areas, to maintain rural character. We do a fair amount of farmland planning, and people will say, well, you could use clustering for farmland planning too. You absolutely could. The farmlands, my experience, and the people that are smarter than me, national farmland people, say clustering doesn't typically work or is used with farmland preservation. It just is, for whatever reason, it's usually not common to preserve farmland with clustering. Could it be done? Absolutely, but it's usually more for recreation or environmental features. Another option for clustering, so option one is you get the same number of units, you just preserve some rural character and put the units on a smaller lot. Option two, some communities allow more units if you cluster. So instead of a 1-to-1 ratio, you might get a few extra units. I'm not going to go through this example in detail, but this is an example of an existing farm divvied up by right with 30 single family units on 3+ acre lots. Another clustering idea of 54 units on smaller lots. And the final solution was single family homes and some multifamily lots, all clustered around, and the rest of it being saved for open space. So clustering is good. One of the things you got to be careful of, and I've seen it happen time and time again, a savvy developer will essentially say, well, I want to cluster and I want more units because your code says I can. But all of the open space ends up being areas he or she couldn't develop on anyway. So it truly wasn't gaining it. The community was giving them more density, but not getting anything in return, because he was basically preserving a pond and a wetland. And their code says you can't build on a pond and wetland anyway. So they said, no, we're not saying no to clustering, we're saying no to that proposal. Do better, come up with some real open space and some real benefit to the town, and we'll think about it. And I think it's critical, if you're considering clustering, put the applicant through their paces and do before and after drawings. Make them submit, an existing drawing, what a non-clustered version might look like, and then what a clustered version might look like. I know this is very confusing, a lot of information, but again, this is in the resource I showed you, and essentially it breaks down by detail, how the units would lay out in a regular development pattern in the middle versus what the cluster might look like. And the reason I show you these detailed drawings is only because when I show you the colored rendering, a lot of people, when I show them these comparisons, they don't believe it. These two colored renderings show the same amount of development done two totally different ways. So the left-hand side is the same amount of industrial, commercial, and residential development done in a suburban landscape as the development on the right. But most of the time when people say that it's not the same, it's an optical illusion, I say, here's the site plans for the middle image, the middle left here, and the right image is these two images. So it's another way to show how clustering can preserve rural character and how you can get the same amount of economic return with using less land in a more dense setting. I apologize, these next slides are kind of boring, not very visually interesting, but the planned development district provisions, I think these are important. I think they often are misused, so I could have a lot of cautionary tales about these, but they're a tool out there that a lot of people take advantage of, a lot of communities use. They're either referred to as planned development districts, sometimes planned unit development districts, so PDDs, PD, or PUDs, they're all the same. And I think when they're done, they can be, like I said, they can be really done poorly. When they're done poorly, I think they are essentially a get out of jail free card. They're essentially talking about, if you don't like your zoning districts and you want to come up with your own idea, propose it. I mean, some of them, these are some of the language they don't like. I'm not going to read all this to you, but I'm just going to highlight some of the language. It talks about, flexibility of use. That's fine. It talks about creative land use controls. Okay, that's fine. I want to know what creative means. I've seen that a lot. Then they go into permitted uses, and the permitted uses are all residential types and all business and non-retail types. To me, that's a little too general. I would be more specific. And some other things to avoid that drive me nuts, and attorneys, the zoner in me drives me nuts, and attorneys hate some of this language. So you've got these review criteria in the middle, A, B, C, D, E. I'm not going to read them all, but item A, in order to approve this project, it has to be determined that it will not negatively affect the orderly pattern of development in the district. I'm a pretty talented planner who's written a lot of planning code. I'm really not sure what orderly pattern of development means. Does it have to develop back to front? What's orderly? I'm not really sure. The item B will be in harmony with nearby uses. Attorneys hate harmony. And the third one will not alter the essential character of nearby neighborhoods. Well, this particular plan development requires 50 acres. So if you've got 50 acres, it's probably, and I've seen town of Dryden requires 100 acres. If you've got 100 acres in the town of Dryden, it's either open space or farmland. And your neighbor is either open space and farmland. So if you're gonna develop 100 acres with some mixed use residential or mixed use commercial project, you're gonna violate item C. There's no way you can. That's violating the essential character of the nearby neighborhood. So these types of review criteria, I don't think are worth a darn. I think you got to be smarter and more tailored. You need to know. I don't expect you to read this, but I can kind of hit the high points. This particular one is very well tailored. It talks about the purpose for this traditional neighborhood design district, and I will read this, is to ensure the development of land within, in this case, the village, as a traditional neighborhood. Its design adopts the urban conventions which were common in the United States from colonial times until the 1940s. And then it goes on to talk about establishing neighborhoods. It goes on to talk about complete streets and walkability. As you read this, it's painfully obvious that they're looking for a traditional neighborhood development. So there's no gray area. Then it goes into multiple pages of what uses can and can't be done. It goes into detailed design requirements. So as you go through this plan development district, this particular example, there's no gray area for the applicant or for the review boards. Some other things to keep in mind with plan development districts that relate to density and design is the minimum lot sizes. Like I talked about, the biggest one I've ever saw was 100 acres in the town of Dryden. The smallest I've ever seen is the city of Rochester requires 2 acres. If you're going to put this on your books and you think it's a good tool, then make it usable. 100 acre minimum lot size, I think, is silly. I just don't think that makes sense. From our studies in an urban setting, 2 acres can work. We've done a lot of different kind of fit tests and scenarios in the office for clients, and just because we get bored at lunch, we came up with in a village setting, 10 to 15 acres is kind of a good minimum where you can actually build a neighborhood from scratch. There's enough room to build the walkable streets and get enough houses where you can actually build a neighborhood. So if you're looking for a neighborhood development, 10 to 15 acres is a good start. If you're in a really urban setting, 2 acres can work. So you got to give that minimum lot size requirement a little bit of thought. And then you have to be very aware of the rest of your code. So for example, does your code have building and design requirements in it like we've talked about tonight? If not, you have to put them in the planned development district. Does it require, do you want mix of uses? If you do, like some commercial, some residential, put them in the planned development districts. If you don't, say that. If your code's got really good shared parking language elsewhere in the code, reference it. If it doesn't talk about shared parking anywhere in the code, make sure you put it in the planned development district, because the nice thing about a planned development district is you can reduce the amount of pavement through shared parking. You should be able to get buildings that relate to each other, like Dennis said earlier. So all that needs to be in writing, either somewhere else in your code or in the planned development district. So if you use these, just make sure you set them up correctly, and so you're getting what you want. There's some other little tricks that can help you get what you want, and and for the sake of clarity, when you're putting your codes together, this is even building design, this is code design, formatting. Make them easy to read as best you can. It'll go a long way to getting what you want. This is a commercial district framework that we did for a village in the Finger Lakes area. The purpose statements, the use, the permitted and specially permitted uses, the dimensional requirements and the bulk requirements. So we've got 5 pages of information that used to be on 40. 5 pages is a lot more easy to implement properly and effectively than 40. So just make sure your code is working for you and it's not putting in unintended roadblocks. Make sure your review requirements, like I said, are user-friendly. I'm not saying we're trying to give developers a free pass or anything like that, not at all, but we find most obstacles in codes were unintended. And one of the things we always do is actually we'll storyboard the current review process, and I can't tell you the number of times we run into a dead end. I'm like, well, what happens when this happens? And then the code enforcement officer just says, well, we don't know. We just refer to the attorney and we've tried to kind of figure it out. So if you're going to start to talk about design review and maybe plan development districts and clustering, things that are going to help with creative density designs, you got to make sure your review processes are ready to handle that. So make sure your current processes work. And then if you're going to start to institute like architectural review, or what I actually think is more appropriate is more of a project review committee. If you're going to start to institute that thinking into the review processes, make sure your current ones are functional and not overly cumbersome. Let me just see on time. Oh, I'm pretty much done. So 8:30, I'm going to wrap up. The last thing I'm going to say, I can do this in 2 minutes.
John, take your time. You're good.
Okay. All right. So now I won't give the backstory. Basically, right now, there's a lot of good visualization tools right now. Make sure you know what your code results in. This is a code update we're working on. It'll be adopted in the next couple months. Simulate your code. Don't just write it. Say, all right, what are these? What will this result in? In this particular city, they wanted this neighborhood that has some old industrial uses hanging around. They wanted the residential uses to come back and fill in the gaps. So all the buildings that are in white are existing homes. This big open space is a park. And then all these buildings that are green, yellow, and red are essentially new buildings that could be built under the code. So we tried to get the height right. We tried to get the multifamily right. The architect that we worked with was pretty careful to make sure the multifamily buildings would read as 2 or 3 smaller single family homes. So no surprises. We did a couple draft code versions. The architect visualized them. We showed the client and we got the one that worked best for Geneva. So again, there's really not a lot of excuse right now to say, oh, I didn't know the code was going to result in that. Use Seeker. I think Seeker gets forgotten about. Design requirements are great. Critical. I can't say enough. I'm a big fan. But don't forget about Seeker. I mean, questions 17 and 18 on the part 2 are pretty important. Consistency with the community plans. I mean, if your comp plan or downtown plan talks about walkable streets and good architecture, and you're getting a project that doesn't contribute to either, then it's not consistent. When it talks about consistent with community character, if you're a walkable village with smaller scale buildings and someone wants to put up a large monolithic multifamily project, then in my opinion, it's not consistent with community character. So use Seeker, don't just use it as an afterthought. It's not an inconvenience, use it to your advantage. Finally, to wrap up, and Grace, my colleagues texted me the results of the community preference survey are done. But the takeaways are, if you want to get what you want, make sure your plan and code are in line with your values. If you've got an out-of-date plan and out-of-date code, and then you're asking the developer to do something, we saw Steinmetz had these cool pictures. We want the developer to do that, but your code doesn't help you. That's really not fair to anybody. Use the tools that are available. For example, Dennis's office has put together with the assistant of an architect, the community design manual. It's on their website. It's one of the best design manuals I've seen. So use it. It's for Ulster County, by Ulster County, and it's an amazing resource. If you're not familiar with it, download it. It's awesome. Get outside design assistance. And we all are comfortable as board members referring the project to what's our village or town engineer say about the project, and that's necessary. I mean, engineers are really good at telling us that water is going to roll downhill, but they're not really good at telling us what the building should look like. Reach out to an architect for design assistance, reach out to a planner for site assistance, reach out to a landscape architect. You know, engineers are brilliant, but they're not designers. So make sure you get the right resource in the room if you're doing a multi-family project or a mixed use project or something like that. And finally, from my own time as a site plan review coordinator and a village planning board chair, be stubborn. Very rarely did I get a great project handed to me the first time through. You know, you've got to be stubborn. These projects are going to outlive all of us. I mean, they generally have a 40 to 70 year lifespan, give or take, depending on the construction material. So, you know, use every opportunity you can to improve the character of your community and not detract from it. Don't be afraid to say no. I'm not saying a formal no, but my whole thing was, geez, I love your multifamily business idea. I just hate the package. You know, that was always the message. I love the proposal. I hate the package you wrapped it in. Let's work towards a better package and a better site layout. So the applicant was generally put at ease saying, well, they like my project. My architect just has to do better, versus, geez, I hate my project. It's two totally different conversations. So we already talked about these, but I thought this was pretty neat. And then I'm going to, Dennis has my contact information, but I'm going to give me 1 second, and Grace has got the CPS results. And as we're answering questions, I can just kind of sift through them. I don't have to belabor the CPS results. But if there's questions, Dennis, I can try to answer them while I'm hunting this down.
So now is the time, folks, if you have any questions for John or for other members of the planning department or comments you'd like to make, please use the question and answer function, raise your hand function, and we'll try to accommodate you. So one of the questions, John, is, are there suggested legal tools to pair with cluster development incentives? Is there incentives given for clustering, preserving open space, and what legal tools are most user-friendly?
Oh, all right. So good question. Let me just make sure I turn this off first. There's one thing I didn't talk about today. The answer is yes. And the one thing you may have purposefully or inadvertently stumbled into, there's another tool out there called incentive zoning, which can be a standalone tool, or it can be used in terms of clustering. Incentive zoning is, some people call it zoning for dollars. I don't like that term, but that's one thing people will describe it as. I think you've got to be very careful and very specific in what you will take in terms of a community benefit. So I had one client, when it came to incentive zoning, they said, well, transportation improvements should be one of the things that we can offer as an amenity. And I said, wait a second, you mean like a right turn lane? He said, yeah. And I go, you should be requiring that anyway. So if you start to set up these other amenities or these other things you want to protect through clustering or through incentive zoning, make sure they're above and beyond what you would normally ask for during a regular development review process. Is there a legal resource out there? Not that I'm sure there is, not that I'm aware of. I've just got my libraries, I've got a ton of libraries on this stuff. So, but in terms of a legal resource to say, these are the things that you can and can't look at, let me ask around. And if I can put my hands on something, I'll send it off to Dennis.
Thanks, John. John, I have a quick one I'd ask you to address, and that is the reluctance of some boards to essentially engage in design review, absent something specific in the code that gives them the power to do that.
Great question. So here's, you ask 3 different planners and 3 different attorneys, you get 6 different answers. There's 2 things. I think the best practice is to make sure you have that power in your code, or that the legislative body has given you that oversight. Now, having said that, as I said at the end of my presentation, I'm a firm believer that seeker essentially starts to flirt with that power on its own. I think it's absolutely fair to, when you're talking about community character or visual impact, to talk about the architecture of a building, to talk about the scale of a building. I think you can get to a design review light through seeker. I think if you want to go down the rabbit hole and really get into more formal design review and more issues related to design review, then I think having the legislative body formally designate that power to an architecture review board or the planning board or something like that is the right way to go. But I personally believe that seeker allows you to talk to some of these issues now without that power.
Thanks, John. All right, any other questions? Anyone want to raise their hands?
There's a bunch of questions in the Q&A, Dennis.
Oh, I'm only seeing 2.
Okay, let's see. Here we go. One from earlier on. Why would the developers there go to so much trouble to have top architects design buildings using local vernacular and then not include sidewalks? That was specific to a particular photo you showed.
Yeah, and is that, hold on, let me just see if that's on the screen. So I'm guessing it's this one, because that's the local vernacular. And you can't see it, but there's actually on this side of the street, on the left-hand side of the street is a park, is a green space. And that's where the sidewalk is. So this sidewalk to nowhere right here actually puts you across the street to sidewalks. Is that the perfect scenario? No. Is a double loaded sidewalk better? Sure. I think the compromise in this town was it saved the developer a little bit of money, and the argument, I'm not saying that by this, but in rural America, there's not sidewalks everywhere. So there is a sidewalk system. It's one-sided in this, literally one-sided in this development. Like I said, I don't think that's a perfect scenario, but that's the answer.
All right, next question. Any thoughts on using incentive zoning to increase affordable housing?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting where this is where Ulster County is different from, upstate in Western New York, where I've spent a lot of my career. We've put incentive zoning in and density bonuses and things of that nature in various development projects. And quite frankly, the market here has never taken advantage of it. Land's just not that valuable here. Down in your neck of the woods, that is something that I think is worth considering. So yes, I think that is a good practice. Like I said, in our neck of the woods, it just hasn't really bared any fruit or borne any fruit.
All right, next question I have is, you mentioned, and it's used frequently, the term not consistent with the character to Hamlet as a way to maintain quality or look. But what if your Hamlet doesn't have a lot of charm, history, and just some less desirable suburban developments? Also, when does one inject new kinds of architecture rather than just traditional? So I guess a more modernistic one.
Yeah, no, a couple questions and unrelated answer. One of the challenges I think when codes talk about relating to the development around it or character around it, and if all you have is suburban, or if you have a lot of suburban, gas station, home, whatever the case may be, you're setting yourself up to be compared to the stuff you may not want. So just be careful of that in your codes when you're talking about surrounding area. So great question. So you've got the fun opportunity to essentially create a vernacular from scratch. I mean, that's where you get design charrettes, workshops through either a comprehensive plan or Hamlet town center document, neighborhood center plan, something like that. You can create that. You can actually say, all right, what is our vernacular? What kind of projects do we want to strive towards getting? What's the architecture? So one, it's incredibly challenging, but it's incredibly rewarding. So there's an opportunity to essentially start from scratch and figure that out. There's another part to that question, Rob, that I'm forgetting. What was it?
Let's see. Oh, when is the time appropriate to put away from traditional, but doing a alternative style, maybe a more modernistic kind of style? When would that be appropriate?
Yeah, fun to think about. I deliberately didn't put any in there, but I almost put a couple mixed use and multifamily projects in our survey that were modern, but I wanted to, without having the benefit of conversation and the time constraints, I thought I was just going to keep it simple. Beauty's an eye of the beholder. One of my different architect friends, like, I don't love wavy metal, and you're seeing a lot more wavy metal on some of these buildings and metal paneling and things of that nature. It's just not something that appeals to me. But he's fine with it. He said, John, as long as you get the transparency, and as long as you get the windows and the proportion of the buildings up to the street, modern materials can work. So that's one area where that's up to the community. You know, how it's very common for codes to say, like, wafer board, if you know what that is, or T111 siding. These are kind of cheap building materials you might see on like a backyard shed. Some codes will say wafer board not allowed, metal paneling not allowed. So you can prohibit some of these materials. The question becomes, do you want to? I'm still not in that modern architecture camp yet, but that's just me being a little old fashioned. I think that's up to each community to give designers creative license or not. There's really no right or wrong answer.
John, I want to go back to your answer with respect to what happens if your vernacular is not the best, and how do you choose where to go. I would just like to urge planning boards is that's not an excuse to go nowhere. It's not an excuse to essentially say, well, since it doesn't look good now, we might as well continue to make projects that don't look good or don't fit into where our aesthetics may be, had we had an opportunity to essentially to improve our aesthetics.
Amen. And I whoever said that comment, I give you a lot of credit, because I've had a lot of clients, in a lot of places say, you know, and then we have our charming Hamlet, and I have to call them on it. I mean, my job is to poke and prod. I'll say, wait a second, you've got a defunct mini mart, a gas station, and a used car sales place on all three corners. And in the fourth corner, you've got a historic church. I don't see the charming Hamlet. Am I crazy, or am I missing something? And then they're like, you know what, you're right. We kind of have lost and they'd say, well, it used to look like this and it used to look like that. So that was then we got on the same page and had a more productive conversation. But it's good that whoever said that is kind of honest with his or her assessment of their current condition.
And before I get to the next question, we do have in the community design manual a typology or place type that is called new neighborhoods. So urge you to look at that. The next question is, can the planning board also speak to these issues if they're explicitly stated as community values in the comprehensive plan, even if not yet in the code?
Yes. Yes, and I forgive me, I don't have a court case handy, but we have to go for legal training every few years. And there was actually a court case not too long ago, in the last 5 years, maybe 6, where the code was out of sync with the plan, but the plan had clearly stated parking should be in the back, downtown needs to go in this direction. The code hadn't caught up with it yet, and the court just deemed and took the side of the planning board, saying that's what the planning board's role is. The planning board is the keeper of the vision, the keeper of the direction, and they're implementing the comp plan, and the code hadn't kept up yet. So there is legal support for that approach. I do not recommend that approach. I mean, clearly, if you know your values, get your code fixed. Even if it's as simple as even if it's a Band-Aid, the document that is available from Dennis's office, reference it in your code. You don't necessarily have to adopt it hook, line, and sinker, but you can actually refer to documents outside the code. It's not the best practice, but it's better than nothing. So you could talk about being consistent with the principles and design criteria established in that Ulster County manual.
Yeah, John, we've actually had codes do that.
Yeah, it's a great Band-Aid. I'm not saying it's a bad Band-Aid. I'm just saying it's a great thing to start with.
Next question is actually one where they want examples of good architectural work in construction of commercial buildings, such as eateries, small stores, along state routes in small towns and villages of the county.
So I'm assuming when they say, I'm assuming you're like a one-story when you say small stores. So stuff we didn't show today. One-story, smaller scale stuff. That's my guess. I don't know when they say small scale, smaller scale than what we showed, because we have a lot of imagery about that. For time tonight and the fact that Dennis challenged me with the word density, I didn't spend any time on good one-story projects because to me that's not density. I'm not saying they don't have their place. I'm just saying they didn't have their place in the presentation tonight. But there's a lot of examples of good one-story projects out there. We've got hundreds of pictures of them. So they can be found. And one, I don't know if this person has like a brand name in mind or not, but one of the best planning tools ever is Google Images. So if you're presented with, you name it, Taco Bell, Sonic, Delta Sonic, if it's a Franchise America, type in Dollar General building and then go to Google Images. And it'll take a while. It took me a while at Dollar General. But if you spend half an hour, 45 minutes, you'll find a building that looks pretty darn nice done by some corporate chain. And so you can always use your own buildings against them if it's corporate America. If it's not, then you just have to go for just other good examples of one-story construction. But if it's a franchise, I guarantee you Google Images can find you an attractive building that they've done somewhere.
The next question is, parking is always a challenge in expanding existing hamlets. Any suggestions how to creatively combat those issues?
Yeah, the old architect saying is form follows function. I think form follows parking. I mean, if you look at this images, I have them on the screen. I mean, they work. If you put the parking in front, you're automatically setting yourself up for a character, no matter what your building looks like. You put the parking in the back, it's automatically setting you up for a different kind of environment. So the trick is try to get it in the back. Worst case, get it on the side. If it's side yard parking, make sure it's set back from the front wall of the building so the building is at least more dominant as you go down the streetscape. You can also get a little more technical and limit, if the site is 100 feet wide, you can say, look at no more than 30% of the frontage can have exposed parking. So it has to be building and maybe decorative walls or landscaping and then side yard parking. Best case scenario is if you can get shared parking. And I was actually, my time doing hands-on development reviews, I'd ask almost every applicant, do you need this much parking and do you want this much parking? More than half of them said, no, this is just what the code's requiring me to do. So one, get your code right. Don't have suburban parking requirements. I've seen usually suburban for retail is anywhere from 7 to 10 spaces per thousand, usually around 7. You don't need that. In a hamlet, you can get down to 3 for retail and office. So make sure you're not asking for too much parking. And then I'm not saying we legally could have done it, but the attorney's like, well, you're probably fine on the planning board. If they said, no, I'd rather not build this much parking, we would not require them to build it and have them set that land aside and leave it green space. And that way, if they ever needed it, they could build it, but we didn't require it. We probably should have pushed a variance, but we just kind of nuanced it. So yeah, try to stick parking in the back or on the side, try to minimize its view, and then through your code, make sure you're not requiring a suburban highway level of parking in a tiny hamlet. The two should have different parking requirements.
All right. Next question is, how do you avoid lowest common denominator thinking?
That's a tough one. You can't avoid it. Yeah, I'll rephrase your question. How do you deal with it? You're always going to get that. You're going to get I'm trying to build the cheapest project going. I don't want to spend the money. I don't have the creativity. I've got the world's worst engineer, and he's also my architect. And he's my brother. So that's who I use. I mean, that's hard. And that's where being stubborn comes in. That's where the services of another design professional who can say, oh, all right, so you need a building of this space. You need this many spaces. I understand your program. What if you rearrange the pieces like this? So I think one of the worst things you can say to an applicant, especially one you're not happy with, is, we don't like it, go back and go away and do better. I think that's a poor response by a board. I think you need to give them informed feedback. and it's hard. I think someone asked earlier about not having design training on a board or something like that. You know, it's the worst thing you can do is send them away with no comments. Probably the second worst thing you can do is send them away with 3 different opinions from the same board. You know, that's where I think an outside professional, design professional, is instrumental in getting the board together and saying, look, here's 3 different scenarios. This one's the obviously best scenario, or which ones, as a board members, which one do you like? So I do think having that design profession to facilitate that conversation between lay people and the applicant is so often overlooked, as the opportunity is so often overlooked. I think it's sad, because once you have had success with that scenario, you'll never go back. And you don't have to do it for every project. I mean, we used to only use a design professional in my village for like new construction, more significant stuff. If someone was changing their siding on their building, we didn't love it, we weren't going to pay an architect to tell us what they should do. But if it was a significant project, we would do that. And oh, by the way, just like you can charge your applicant for engineering review services, you could also charge them for design review services. So we had a designated village architect, and then just like we have a designated village engineer. And when we used our village engineer to review his or her plans, they would pay for that review. And when we would use our village architect to review his or her plans, they would pay for that review as well. So it's just in terms of another way to fund these services. You know, get outside help, because get training like these things tonight. Hopefully this is helpful to you. But again, if you're not a design professional, you're not going to become one through 4 hours of training every year. So reach out and get help.
All right, next question. How would you approach a town with outdated minimal planning and zoning codes in a rural setting? How might you also encourage them to rethink the idea of positive development or density? And how do rural towns attract development?
I think first and foremost, as a consultant, we have to be a little bit of a salesperson. It comes with the territory. But for me, sales is easy because I believe so passionately about what I do and how important it is. I think that the idea is, first, if you're trying to convince the elected officials or other people in the value of planning and zoning, first start with planning. And there's few different ways. You know, planning equals better funding, better positioning for grants. If you're talking, unfortunately, I think most of the time when people get alarmed about zoning is when they've gotten a bad project in their project, in their community. They say, geez, I can't stand that project. I can't believe that happened. And that's usually an impetus for them to fix their zoning codes. So I think it starts with a conversation with the elected officials and saying, you know, pointing it out to them, saying, here's a disconnect between who we are as a community and what our codes say or what our plans say. This is not a sales pitch, but we do kind of a complimentary code evaluation for clients that are interested, just to say, here's some issues we see with your code. Things of that nature, I think, can be very valuable, because until you get into a code and you can kind of pull it apart and find out what's wrong, most of the time people just ignore it. So I think you use any means necessary. Good planning helps you with grant money. And then once you get good planning, why would you not take the next step into your code? You know, if that's the sales pitch to the elected officials, great. If it's a bad project that you got burned by, unfortunately, that's a good reason to say, let's update our code. It's education. Just got to, work with the county, work with the elected officials, keep hammering them to understand the importance of zoning. I think in reality, I know I'm biased, but even some of my engineers agree with me. I think zoning is probably the most significant thing a board will ever do, is updated zoning in terms of shaping your community. I mean, replacing water lines is critical, replacing sidewalks is important, but zoning really shapes the character of your community like no other effort. So it's just a matter of making sure the elected officials understand how important it is. And I can't remember the rest of the question. It was like 3 parts.
So John, how to attract development, and I just wanted to add to your comment. One of the things that we've said is that sometimes if you sit back and you sort of wait for people to apply, you get the type of development that you may not want. Whereas in many other instances, if you affirmatively ask for development, working with landowners or working with vacant properties or even blighted buildings, you can sort of tell people that if you're willing to develop here, we want you to, A, and B is we'll help you go through that process rather than putting up an adversarial position to start with. And so to affirmatively ask for development, particularly in certain areas of your community, is really a game changer in many instances to get developers interested.
Absolutely. We did, you know, the village I live in is just under 6,000 people, and it's rural around it. The town total population is 13,000, including the village. So 6,000 in the village, 7 in the town. And the one thing that the leadership 15, 20 years ago realizes there was really no senior housing in our community. There is no way to age in place. So they did some research. They saw some other examples around the county, around the region, and they essentially proactively created a PRDS or PUDS, can't remember. I think it's PRDS, Planned Residential District Senior for the S. So they proactively rezoned it. They annexed it into the village so it would have water and sewer. And then they went out to RFP to 5 different developers and said, who wants to do this? We never owned the land though, which I thought was interesting. So it was always working with the landowner and saying, is it okay if we annex your property? Is it okay if we rezone it for this? We think it's going to help you financially. So the village did all the legwork. I don't know how well the property owner made out. I think they made out pretty good. But we solicited 5 developers and got 2 people interested in it.
Yeah, that's a great story.
The annexation with the town was a little adversarial, but that's all another story.
Here's another question. Ag and Markets Law helps encourage commercial development into rural residential neighborhoods. Any creative ideas on how to address this?
Yeah, but let me ask, so I'm guessing it's seen as a negative. I'm not trying to put words in the person's mouth, but to address this would mean that they're not supportive of it, perhaps. Ag and Markets is great and tough at the same time. You know, it's challenging. I think I don't know exactly the address question, so I may miss the mark, but we run into like zoning for farm stands. Some codes talk about all the farm stand products have to be grown on premises, or they can only bring 30% of the goods from somewhere else. There's all these different things. Ag and Markets essentially says, no, if it's going to help a farm survive, the farm stand can do what it wants. Ag and Markets would technically say a farm stand would not need site plan review. And I know I disagree in the sense that if you've got a small farm stand, you're having cars pull off the side of a state road or a highway, you need to make sure that the cars are being pulled off in a safe manner and they're far enough off the road. You know, we're not asking for pavement and drainage plans, but just some basic safety requirements and considerations. But Ag and Markets is they're great, but they're tough. You know, they're definitely in the farmer's corner regardless. So you got to work with them and try to just get, you know, bare bones, like site plan. We talked to them and said, all right, we won't require a special permit for a farm stand, but can we at least do site plan review for a farm stand? And they kind of said, well, we would rather nothing, but okay. You know, they didn't endorse it, but they saw the concern because it was a high-speed road. So it's one of those situations where you kind of come up with an alternative solution and see if they go for it.
Last one, Rob?
Yep. So it's a response to question about parking in Hamlets. Can communities also stop trying to meet expectations of drivers who want to park super close to their destination, especially if safe walkability is available to mobile visitors? What are examples of successful alternatives?
Yeah, I think my experience with parking is the experience getting from your car to the front door. I think that's or the back door, whatever the case may be, getting from your car to the building. You know, if the experience is pleasant and interesting, that's half the battle. I'd say actually it's more than half the battle. Because the front door situation is going to be tough and unrealistic for everybody. So I do think it's a matter of putting the parking is, in smart walkable proximity to where people want to go, and then from there making it as pleasant a walk as you can. I mean,
Yeah, John, our review function, we basically interpret the local zoning code, which is access to a project to include pedestrian access.
Mm-hmm.
So we're looking how to get across parking lots, how to get to the front door, as well as how to get vehicles in and out of the site. And then on flexibility of parking, what we've done in some instances is indicate to communities that if they're really concerned about essentially the turning away development or having problems with development meeting parking requirements, or that the parking requirements start to interfere with the site plan amenities that they want, you can begin to start to think about allowing a certain percentage of on-street parking to be counted as meeting the demands for the parking facility for the project.
Absolutely. I was thinking more Hamlet, but yeah, on street, and if there's transit service, if there's transit service, you could do another reduction. We get a lot of conversation about joint versus shared parking.
Yeah.
Joint parking generally is if you've got 3 uses and they require 30 spaces each, you still got to provide 90. They can just be all commingled. Shared parking, you can actually reduce the pavement. So if you've got a church next door, and obviously most churches it's Sunday service, so the rest of the week the parking lot is underutilized or empty. If you can come up with an agreement with that church, if you're within X amount of feet, usually it's anywhere from 200 to 500 feet. I think 500 is a little too far, but 200 feet of another lot that you've got a relationship with, then you can count part of their parking towards your requirement. Not all of it, but you can start to more fully utilize parking resources in a downtown setting or urban setting.
So John, that's the last question. So
yeah, the other thing I just always want to say, because I can't help myself, I'm an avid cyclist. So the other thing, especially in rural settings too, I mean, keep in mind, bicycle access, even if it's as simple as bike parking. I think the range of cycling is 10 times a pedestrian. So I mean, if the parking is there and it's a place that you can lock your bike up safely, that can help.
Yeah, that's a great comment. That's a really great comment. I wanted to give you time to go over your preference photos that are up on the screen.
Oh yeah, sure. Thanks. So Grace, thanks for putting these together so fast. So what she did was actually take the scores and did a mean score. So what we would normally do if we did this in person, it would be like a 0 to 10 scale. So we could refine the results a little bit more and have more fun with the numbers, but 0 to 5 or 1 to 5 works. So when you look at these, again, normally we'd have a conversation. What I think is interesting is in the beginning, that word cloud, not all, but I'd say well over half of the word cloud words were negative or of a concern, saying that, geez, density has got too much traffic or bad design or all these things. So there was a lot of concerns with density, which I fully understand, and I would echo a lot of those concerns. But when you look at the visual representation of some of the different types of density, people seem favorable. Now, the one thing we didn't ask tonight because it wasn't appropriate, if we did a survey like this for your community, we would ask you, are these appropriate for your community? I left that part out because we've got all different types of towns and settings and villages and city and different audience tonight. So I just kind of left that open-ended. But when you look at these images, especially if you look at this one down here, the one that scored 3.7 versus the one above it that scored 1.7, it's pretty common. You've got, in the lower one, you've got more of a traditional streetscape, smaller lots. You've got more architectural detailing of the buildings. You've got streetscape, you've got tree lawn. And the big kicker when it comes to a lot of residential stuff is the presence and siting of garages. So we could show you time and time again where houses with garages exposed to the street generally score lower than houses with garages behind them. Not saying you shouldn't have garages, but it's amazing the impact that garages can have on some of these rating systems. Not as obvious with this one, but clearly the traditional neighborhoods, the 3.2, the 3.7, and 3.8 scored very high. Rural America scored the highest, no surprise there. But what I would call larger lot suburban residential development scored the lowest. So in this case, I would say density wins in this case, except when you get to rural America. When it comes to single family residential density, when you go into multifamily, for these are all dense. So it's not, I don't see any mandate or opinion on too dense or less dense, but in terms of design, again, parking, same with commercial projects, asphalt, 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 all of them scored low. Nice public realm, okay, public realm will be better in a few years when the trees grow in, nice public realm. So again, that creating that streetscape, walkable environment tended to make these score better. And then, Dennis's observation of the architectural detailing of the buildings makes a huge difference. So properly placed on the site, properly designed building with some aesthetics. What I think is interesting, if you look at this one that scored 3.6, those buildings are not ornate. They're meant to be an old farmhouse, which, they got a stoop, a peaked roof, and some shutters. These are not highly decorated buildings, and yet it scored extremely high. So proper streetscape, traditional design elements win the day when it comes to multifamily design. Looking at commercial and mixed use, and again, we didn't pick on a lot of single-story mixed use. We threw the Walmart one in there and for effect, and McDonald's, but single-story bad in this, not my opinion, in the results. Single-story bad all the way across. So the 1.2, 1.4, 1.7, auto-dominated single-story commercial environments. And then as you have multi-story, and it's dramatic, it's significant, it doubles. I mean, there's no middle ground. You got these scoring less than 2, and all of a sudden you're almost to 4. So mixed use, pretty dense multi-story development scored pretty high with some of these, especially when you get to the 2 and 3 stories. So these, the 3 highest scoring images to me are, I think, visually slightly smaller in scale. So maybe the Ulster County has a sensitivity to 4 and 5 story buildings, might be a little too dense for Ulster County in some places. I love that the last image was the highest, the before and after. So the 1.7 is the before, the 4.5 is after. And again, the streetscape, the street width hasn't changed. It was not even a road diet, but it just shows what density and what good land design can do in addition to a nice street project. So it sounds like people would be receptive to density in some form in Ulster County. Not everywhere, not everyone, but there seems like there may be a place for higher density commercial, higher density residential if done properly in Ulster County. The challenge to all of you as decision makers is doing it properly. That's the challenge.
Thank you, John. So that completes, am I correct, folks? Anybody have anything else? So that completes today's seminar, and I'd like to extend our thanks to John and to Grace. John has put his contact information up so you have it. And to the Barton LaJudas family for putting this presentation on for us. I think it's been very informative. I hope you've got your questions answered, and I hope if there's any additional questions, you can email John or phone John. We will put this presentation up on our website. Give us till the end of the week to get that done, as well as the preference surveys. And John, I'm going to ask you to send them to us.
Oh, well.
Again, thank you. Any parting words, John?
No, just thank you, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity, Dennis, Rob, thanks for your help. And this has been great. Dennis and I talked about if you, not saying you need to sit around and want to hear me talk again, but if there's something that prompted your thoughts tonight about more about design or more about this or more about that, communicate with Dennis, and I'd be happy to come back sometime in the future.
Oh, thanks for that, John. That's very nice of you. Really appreciate it. And extend our appreciation to Glenn as well.
I will do that.
Okay, everyone. Robert, thank you.
Have a good night, everybody.
Good night,
everybody.